typing the whole thing for a while won't work quite as well. So I'm Brendan McAdams. For those of you who don't already know me, I work for Netflix. I guess I'll ask the question again. How many of you have heard of Netflix? And put your hand down if you don't have a Netflix account. Yeah. Or put your hand up if you have a Netflix account. Okay, I'm disappointed in the ratio there, but that's ever. We are in like Germany, Switzerland, Benelux, France, a bunch of the rest of Europe now, so you have no excuses. There's lots of awesome movies and other things. And now that I'm done with the sales pitch, how many of you were at my talk yesterday? Right, I talked about how we're using Scala, so it looks like maybe a little more than half. Yesterday's talk was very much kind of an experience report, talking about what my team at Netflix is doing with Scala, the kinds of things we're doing. I think actually the way the talk went, a lot more of the interest seemed to be in talking about things like immutable deployments and other things. But there's always, there is definitely some interest, and I think from people who stop me in the hall afterwards about using things like Scalatra and Swagger in particular, because I've been really fascinated by it, having not played with it much before I joined Netflix. So that's what I want to talk about today. And if we get a chance, we'll maybe go through a bit of the use of Akka and features with it, because I think that was originally in the talk title. But I think the focus really is going to be, let's talk about building an API. And I went back and forth about writing slides because I tend to avoid live coding because I'm always afraid of being embarrassed by everything going wrong. But I think I've been doing this talking thing for long enough that I can probably pull it off, or at least fake it, or blame everything on IntelliJ. That's my backup plan. So what I want to do instead is let's actually walk through looking at these things, looking at these tools, looking at Scalatra and Swagger, putting an API together, and understanding how we leverage these tools and what we do, and then we can do a little bit of interactivity, or we can watch everything go horribly wrong, which is one of the best parts of live coding as an audience. I've set up a sort of basic skeleton of a project, partly because otherwise I'd be flipping back and forth between the docs to get everything set up right. But I at least want to give you guys a quick, hey, how many of you are familiar with Giterate? So only a few. There's, I'm trying to think if I can pull this up really quick. This is Nathan Hamlin, who, if you don't know him, is kind of awesome. He's based in New York. He's done a bunch of things. The idea with Giterate is that it's meant to be, you can pull up templates. So somebody can provide a basic template for an SBT project, and then you use Giterate to fetch that down. And Homebrew supports it, so you can do brew install Giterate, and then you'll see projects that have these templates provided. And so if you look here, there's an example with SoftProps, which is Doug Tangren, where in his Git repo, he's got this unfiltered.g8 project, which is the template. And so when you want to set things up, you go ahead and just say G8 and the template. This is actually the quickest and easiest way to get a Scalatra project up and going. I've already set one up, but just as a quick look at that, there's probably a window somewhere here. Just bear with me. Colors, let's go white background. Readable for everybody? Right. So this is the command that I ran earlier, which is G8, which is using Giterate, and that's Scalatra / Scalatra-SBT, and that's a template that'll just help you get a project set up. So if I hit this, it's going to go through, it's going to ask me a bunch of questions about my organization. We'll call it io.scala. Fundamental questions that we typically have to do to set up our projects are there. And then ultimately it's going to create a directory for me, and everything that I need to get started with my Scalatra is there. The project file with dependencies, all of the base files, all of these other things that we typically need to get started. So that, I mean, that's at least something. And if you look at the Scalatra website, that's in the Getting Started guide. So at least that's your quickest and easiest way to get up and running with Scalatra. That said, how many of you are familiar with REST? So most of you. And I'm not talking about mapping here. We're talking about, you know, building APIs. And that's the part of this that's really useful. So I'm not going to talk about building a website with Scalatra, but what I really want to talk about is building a REST API. You know, doing something where we can actually have something useful, like what we're building. What I described in my talk yesterday, for those of you who went, is that the team that I'm on at Netflix, we build half of a product. Our product is for partners of Netflix to provide information about devices that run Netflix. And my half of the team builds this Scala-based API service. In many cases, we may interact with the database or call other services within Netflix. And then we've got a UI team. And that UI team uses AngularJS on top of our REST APIs to talk to our service. And they use some tools like Swagger, which I'm going to show you, in order to easily interact with that. So I can provide documentation and an interactive editor for them to test this API with, and it's very, very powerful. But obviously, we need these documentation and other things. So with that said, there's a couple of HTTP verbs that are important to REST. Anybody want to run me through? There's really 4 major ones that we're talking about. So when I talk to HTTP, there's a bunch of verbs I can give it for what I want to do. In REST, there's a couple that we normally use. So the first one is get. Get said, in REST terms, it says, give me something. So there might be an ID provided or something else, right? Anybody know what the next one would be? Half of you are saying post, half of you are saying a put. Both of them are good. So post usually means what when I'm talking to a REST API? Create. I'm not sure. I heard create. I also heard a bunch of other things that I'm not sure what they were. Create is usually the canonical. When I post, I'm saying, here's something new. Here's something new that I want you to do. What if I want to edit something that's already there? Put, right. And then the last one? Wait, hold on. Delete. I thought I heard get in there too, so. I know there's a couple other verbs like patch, which I've heard people talk about using, and I'm not sure what the right thing is. Apparently there's this API for this spec for JSON to do patches as well that I haven't played with yet. So these are sort of those core verbs that we need in order to do HTTP work. One thing I will say is 2 major things that you should always do if you're building a REST API as a team is 1, make sure that everyone agrees on what these verbs are and what they mean. And 2, agree on error codes. Because it turns out that HTTP error codes are one of those things people get very worked up and upset about when they don't all agree on what they mean. So, and there's a lot of error codes and a lot of them are meaningless. So part of it is making sure everyone agrees. The one nice thing I'll show you is there is a part of Swagger where you can document. These are all the possible HTTP codes I'm going to return to you, and these are what they do. So that's, to start with. Are there questions so far? Am I making sense? Okay, I'm going to take the silence for I'm making sense. So I have set up the rough shot of my Scalatra project called Beautiful APIs, and I think I've made it net.evilmonkeylabs.omgwtf.bbq as my package. So there's a couple pieces. Like I said, I've set things up. I think the easiest demo app for us to build is just going to be a movies API. So think something like IMDb. We're going to have, here's a movie, its info, maybe a few cast members, and that's it. Okay? With Swag, once I have set up the API with the Giterate, so obviously we have our build file. Most of this was automatically filled in by that Giterate that I ran earlier, including the dependencies. I added a couple dependencies. I don't know if we'll do it, but I think the easiest way for storing any information we might store is to use MongoDB, mostly because I wrote the MongoDB driver for Scala, and it's the one that I know the best. There's some extra stuff that I added. So by default, the JSON support is not built in. You have to add that in, and then the Swagger stuff. But here's the really cool part. With the JSON stuff built in, as I'll show you, we can use case classes to communicate back and forth with the UI. And this is one of the parts I really enjoy about what we do, is I don't have to do a bunch of manual conversions between JSON, because I've just got an API so that when you provide me JSON on the front end, I get back the appropriate thing. And now I'm forgetting if I remember the API there. Let's pull this over. And then there's the other piece you'll get, is you will get a file called Scalatra Bootstrap. And this is the part within Scalatra that says when you boot up, these are the servlets that you need, these are all the pieces that you need to connect together. And so by default, you will have, your base servlet, which I already had in there, which was my beautiful Scala APIs, which really does nothing. It's just hello, and that's mounted on the default. So under the Bootstrap, you mount. You say new instance of this servlet and the path that you want it to be at. So beautiful Scala APIs is our root path, and anything under that will then be mounted. So the beautiful Scala APIs is just slash based on this. Make sense so far? So I've added a couple of other items here, including a movie service, which we'll look at in a minute. Actually, we'll look at that now and then go forward. Let's see here. I should probably full screen that. I've done a couple of imports here because I've already set us up to work with Swagger and do a couple of other things. But this is really, it looks a lot like a classic servlet model because of the way that Scalatra runs things. So I've got class movie API service, it extends Scalatra servlet, and I've also mixed in native JSON support as a trade, which gives us support for the JSON conversion and other things. Make sense so far? Right. I've also set up an implicit for JSON formats, which provides me the information for serializing and deserializing to JSON. And then there's an action that runs before our servlet boots up, which sets the content types for what we're speaking at as JSON, which will make it easier for everything to understand what we're doing. Now, as far as Swagger is concerned, I also need to create a definition for a path. So I want a path on my server that provides these Swagger docs. For those of you who went to my talk yesterday, what Swagger, or for those of you who didn't go to my talk yesterday rather, what Swagger is really an API for producing documentation of an API. So we can describe in Scala code what the rules are for a given API endpoint. These are the inputs, these are the outputs, this is what it does. And Swagger produces a JSON specification that says this is our API. And then there's a UI which can produce a nice documentation page from Swagger. Now I've taken a copy of the Swagger UI and dropped it in the static file for the servlet. But what we really want to do is we want the ability to produce that Swagger JSON file from our setup. And that's where this comes in. So there is a servlet that you need to create. It will take an implicit val of Swagger. And while it extends Scalatra servlet, it also extends this native Swagger base. Because the only job of this servlet is to pull together all of the Swagger information that's available in our setup and provide that on an endpoint. And so we need a API info object that will provide things. Because in many cases, so my API at work is internal only. Nobody can access it outside of people within the Netflix network. But you might be building an API that's accessible to people outside of your organization, outside of your network. And so there's info that you want to provide beyond just, this is the name of the API and this is what it does. You might want the website address for contact, an email address to contact people at, and you should provide information about a license. I picked the Perl artistic license because I just wanted to be obnoxious, and I started as a Perl programmer, so why not? So that's just, here, if you look at API info, that's what it's looking for. We've got a title, a description, a terms of service URL, contact, the license, and then any URL that's there. Finally, we extend a Swagger class that defines a couple of things. The Swagger.spec version is a quick and dirty way of, the arguments here are the version of Swagger, because Swagger itself continues to evolve as you go along. The version of your API. Versioning your APIs is really important when you're building REST services. I haven't done it in this demo, but I should. The URL for your REST API should always include a version in it, like v1, v2, etc. Because if you create a new version of your API and you change the interface, you still want to provide the ability for people to work with the old API, or at least be aware that the API has changed and that versioning is important. So we can also provide that API version when we set up our Swagger information. And then finally, we initialize it with a copy of this API info class that says all of the things that we're going to do. And this as well is mounted under the Bootstrap. And I've mounted this on /API-docs. Now I've already got my Swagger, my Scalatra instance running. If you go into SVT, it's wrong thing. Still opened the wrong window. That was really useful. It ends up just being container:start within SVT. And that will boot up the container. And then there's an extra command that you can use to have SVT continue to monitor changes to your code and reload regularly, which is one of those useful things. It's one of my favorite parts of play, which is obviously, as much as we love recompiling our code every time a web thing changes, it's nice to have something going around in the background. And so I've already set up an endpoint here, which is, well, here's that hello world, that servlet that was already set up by default. And then, remember, I mounted everything on API-docs. So when I go to API-docs, all that I get as output is JSON. No, this isn't going to be terribly useful to anyone. And ultimately, it's going to contain a lot more information because we're going to build an API here. But this is the JSON. So wherever you mount that base Swagger servlet, it's going to spit out this JSON for you to work with. And then you can have an instance of the Swagger UI. The Swagger UI is just in JavaScript app. So there's nothing on it right now. This is the one that I set up. But I've got it pointing at my API doc info. So I get a little bit of information here. Here's the base URL. Here's the API version. And then the new Swagger UI is support for doing things like API keys, which if you're building an external API, you probably want. And here's, if I click on info, I haven't modified, so a lot of these links are going to the default, because I haven't really set it up beyond my default, but a lot of these links are going to the default of, so the links unfortunately are going to the default pet store here. But once I get some things into our service, we should be able to see what's going on. So let's go down that road. I've got a movie API service. What I want to do is build an endpoint. So first, let's define a case class. And this should have a couple of things. Name is a string. How many of you are really confused right now? It's okay. Just let me know. So I've got a case class here. I'm going to take a string. I'm going to take a release here, which is optional. Ideally, we should have a release here, but who knows? and then an actor, because I'm going to provide a sequence of movie actors. So that we can see what it looks like. There's two things I want you to see. Actually, you know what? Let's make the release here required and demonstrate option when we look at the actor. So we can have a sequence of sub-case classes here, and Scalatra will still manage to define what they look like. So, first name, middle name, so maybe there's, you know, a very vain actor who doesn't want anyone to know how old they are. So right here, that's it. That's the basic information that I want to provide. And let's whip up a set of movies. I don't know. I can't think of any actors off the top of my head here, but Arnold Schwarzenegger, there you go. I have no idea what Arnold Schwarzenegger's middle name is, so there you go. And I'm probably spelling his name wrong, but and no idea what his year of birth is. If anybody wants to look that up on Wikipedia for me real quick, so we at least have one actor, because I'm not going to know anybody. All right, well, we'll leave it as none, and then. I don't know, Jean Reno, who, you know, is probably the one French actor I know off the top of my head. And he's not even French, is he? He's Italian. But, he is French, okay. I thought I saw something about him being Italian. Maybe I'm wrong. His family's Italian.
1947,
1947. Well, thank you, Stefan.
And his middle name is Alois.
His middle name is what?
Alois.
How do you spell it?
A-L-O-I-S.
A-L-O-I-S. No, Arnold Schwarzenegger's middle name, which somehow removes the mystery.
Why long?
Huh?
Why long for the year?
I don't know, because they use longs a lot. Would you like to be big decimal? Yeah, so what's I'm really not awake yet. Yeah, there you go. No, wait, the legend is Victor Klang. Okay, you know, these facts that, you know, we need now. You know, we're just going to create a movie here that stars Arnold Schwarzenegger, Jean Reno, and Victor Klang. All right, everybody with me so far? We've got this basic set of movies that we can provide. So now we're going to figure out why this is. The great news about writing in Scala is I never have to worry about my demo forgetting the semicolon, as somebody helpfully just pointed out. Now if I can remember the next set of code. So I'm just going to create a get method that lists the items that I want. So movie service is mounted under movies. So we are just going to, oh, and these should probably have IDs too. There, I'm using a long and you can't say anything about it. Completely appropriate. And movie actors should have longs too. You know what? And then this is our first movie. So this get method is just going to be slash, okay? So the way that we start our descriptions of endpoints in Scalatra that we're going to use for Swagger is the verb that's going to be used. And crap. That's the right one. So that's the basic start. And what operation says is that this is a link to a method or a val that's going to describe whatever method that we are using, or whatever our API endpoint is. And so here, list movies is going to be an API operation. And this takes a type argument. That type argument is whatever the return type is going to be of what we're creating. And so in this case, I'm going to make it a seek of movies. Movie. Be great. It almost would be great if I could just say the name of a class with an S at the end and it would automatically become a sequence. It'd be like the greatest language ever. And then this is then the name of the point. And that's actually the bare minimum that we need to do to create a working endpoint. And I think all that I need to do here is return an HTTP response. Scalatra has a bunch of nice shortcuts for response codes. Unfortunately, they do not have a built-in I'm a teapot, and I am going to send a pull request to fix that this week. That is my goal. I want an I'm a teapot default class for that. For those of you that don't know, every year, usually somebody submits an RFC that's a joke. And one year there was hypertext coffee pot control protocol. Apparently is actually used. And there was an extra response code added for 418 I'm a teapot, which is essentially, I don't respond to hypertext coffee pot control code because I'm not a coffee pot. So I'm going to say OK here. And since we have a static list, I'm just going to return movies.default movies. And in an ideal world, this will all work perfectly. But it's live coding, so it probably won't. But to review, wait, movie API service. Look something up in the docs real quick, because I'm an idiot today. I apologize. What is it? Native Swagger base. No, wait. This would be a good time to escape while I'm still looking like an idiot, by the way. So I need sorry, it's really too early according to my body clock. It's like 2 in the morning. And then we just need an application description, which is, I used to be a real programmer who used Vim for everything, and then I got lazy. All right? And now this should be the base of what we need. So you do need this implicit val Swagger. Scalatra is going to feed this in because it sees that it's a Swagger item. You know, this becomes an endless argument, by the way, of how you format your stacks of widths. I'm just going to do it like that, and nobody can say anything about it because it's my talk. So we have our protected and implicit valid JSON formats, which should automatically serialize that seek of movies for me and return the movie. And so now everything is working correctly. No. You know what? It probably died when I failed to compile. Hey, it died when I failed to compile. Unfortunately, you aren't going to see a cool video game with ponies. Bodil just, ultimately did a better talk than I did. But none of us should be surprised by that. That was a pretty cool demo, I have to say. Don't clap at me. There's actually no ponies in this talk. What the hell? Oh, wait. Looking wrong here? This is the part where everything goes horribly wrong. I know, I'm trying to look where that is. It's here at the beginning. This is going well. Sorry? I know. I'm trying to think of what's missing here, and I am not sure. Flower controller. That should be correct. Ah, that's why. Wait, is that there? Yeah, no, that's there. Really good question. I have no idea what's going wrong now.
Where does movie Swagger come from? The class.
Movie Swagger is coming from within Bootstrap, and then that's this here.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
Right. No, that's okay. I'm the one who's utterly failing to provide an adequate demo. And why is this failing? Null pointer exception, trying to initialize. Yes. Never calls what? Yeah, it's being called from here, so that'll do it.
Does movie Swagger implements the Scalatra Swagger or the movie one? That's Swagger.
It implements what it should implement here. Good question. It's maybe a really good opportunity to escape before it gets worse. Sorry?
I think that we don't actually need to contain that because we understand that it should work in theory and we probably write it in the rest of the code.
Okay, yeah, we can do that. Because that is not booting at all. assume, of course, that this has all worked. And one of the nice things, like I said, is that the API operation is going to return what you need. So if we were to, take a post, we could also do this, would be, it's not indexed. So post slash is going to be an operation for add movie. I wonder if changing that to a def would do it.
What about list node? It's initialized after we use it in get. Maybe that's the problem.
Yeah, that's probably what it is, actually. Try this one more time. That was it. I should have known better because I think that was Stefan that gave us the answer, so applaud Stefan. Also, Slick is a really nice product.
But string?
There we go. So among other things in our JSON spec now for Swagger, we see that we've had APIs. So slash movies is a description all about, a service all about movies. So now if I go to slash Swagger. So note now that my new service, and actually the color coding I believe might have been added by Jason Swartz, because I know we have a customized version of the Swagger thing. So I've got my movie service, and then there it is. So when I expand this, I now get, hey, here's a get service. It's color-coded nicely. And I can expand that further. So we can look at movies. And what this says to me is, here's the response class. Here's what we respond with. This is the part that our UI developers love, because for the most part, they're JavaScript developers. They don't want to go look at the Scala code to figure out what the hell's going on. So there's one of two choices. Either we provide them good documentation, or they come and bother us all day helping get things together. So right here is really where I think the most powerful part of Swagger is, which is the zoom to some size. Can you guys read that okay? Okay, how about now? Okay, so we've got response class, and what this says is that when you call this service, we're going to respond with a movie. And it's got an ID, which is an integer, a name, which is a string, a release year, which is an integer, and then actors, because we're talking in JSON terms, is an array of movie actor. And then we break that down further. Hey, this is what a movie actor looks like, an ID of integer. Now this is the nice part as well. Middle name is optional, because we made it an option of string. So what ends up happening is whether they send it as null, because JavaScript developers love null for some reason, if they can either send it as null or omit that field completely, and the parser will fetch that back okay. Birth year, which is optional, first name, last name. So now the important part, what happens if I click on this try it out button? And I get my response, and here is, so among other things, it says, hey, here's the request URL. Again, when they build their application, my UI guys aren't going to call Swagger. They're going to call my endpoint directly, and so it tells them, hey, this is the request URL if you want to actually call this service directly. And my response body, laid out in JSON. So it's an array, and this is our item. And note that that all serialized automatically. It is the greatest movie ever. I mean, it's Arnold Schwarzenegger, Jean Reno, and Victor Klang. We all want to see this movie, coming in 2015. Speaking of which, there will be a Kickstarter up later. We will have to convince these other actors to get in, including Victor. But, yeah. And then we also get our response code. So the response code here is a 200, and any other response headers that are relevant. So this is a get, and I think my time is running down, so we're not going to get to look at as much else as we'd like. But let's look at what a post looks like, at least in terms of, I don't know, maybe creating a mutable data structure within the... This is going to probably end really badly. Don't leave yet, Andy. So we have an API operation here. This is going to just respond with, oh, let's say a string. It's going to say like okay or something else. And this is, oh, we also probably want to add a description here. Well, let's do it for the post. And this is the part where, okay, Swagger offers us a bunch of other things. So I can say, here's my description. It should just be summary. Summary, which is adds a movie to the service. And here's the other part that's important now. We're going to take parameters. So I can say, here's my parameter, and now describe, this is going to be a body parameter, and it's going to be a movie. And the name is, movie. Description. Now I've got no body to my post yet, but what I do have is hasn't updated yet. Let's try moving my computer one more time. So now we have a post as well. Now notice as well, because I added a summary now to my API operation, I get a, hey, this is add the movie to the service. And this changes now, because my response type is going to be a simple string. But now I get information about these are the parameters that I expect from you. And so movie is required. It's going to be a JSON object that follows this thing. So I would need to provide a movie. So let's see if we can quickly... I'm trying to remember what the... this might do it. I don't remember if this is the right parser for this, but... This is the part where I think we're going to go off the rail a little bit. Unfortunately, we're hitting the end of time here, our run time. So this will have to be continued. I apologize for where things ended up. Hopefully, at least you guys have a basic idea of where things look forward. Right now, I can't remember how to actually parse the JSON. But this is a good time to take any questions. Or if you just want to yell at me for giving a terrible talk, this is a good time as well. So any quick questions about what we have gone through? Yes?
I have some pretty dumb questions for you then. Which parts are now Scala specific and which parts are so the operation list?
Right. So the things within the verb are our actual HTTP or actual like service body. And when we say operation, we're also saying, hey, this is the part that is our Swagger operation. And so then the thing within this API operation is what describes that service for Swagger, what outputs that information for us to move forward. Everything else within the actual verbed operation would just be relevant to our code.
When you write the code for the get or the post, you define an operation. Is it possible to separate the real REST operation of the Swagger operation? Like making an annotation or something like that?
So there isn't, as far as I know, annotation support. And part of that is obviously annotation support in Scala is limited. If you write an annotation in Scala, it's actually just a note, I believe, for the compiler. I have not seen, it's possible there are, I have not seen annotations, but there may also be things for other frameworks. So there are, the question was that obviously Scalatra is well integrated into Swagger. Part of that is, I believe, Reverb, who wrote Swagger, is using Scalatra heavily. And so that's a big part of it, and Yvonne does contributions to both. I've seen there are integration layers for other things. I believe the guys at Getty Images released one for Spray recently. I don't know if there's one for Play. But it's not that hard, it would not be that hard to build one. Because ultimately, remember what this is going to produce is a JSON doc. And I believe at each level there's going to be pieces of JSON. So as long as you can output something that meets the spec for Swagger, you could build an API very quickly to do it for what you need to do. But it's made much, much easier by having integration with the server. Yes?
So there is no kind of validation between what your service actually does and what you describe with Swagger, what it is supposed to do. So if you do not actually return something to movie objects, there is no validation between the growth of documentation and implementation.
Correct. And this is the one part where I find it a little fuzzy too. It would be great if it worked a little better, but it is on you to properly describe. So a great example is once or twice, or maybe a few times, I built a service or modified a service and didn't update the parameter list. No, nothing breaks as far as like Swagger doesn't fail to run. It's just if you try to actually work with that, you may be missing a parameter that's not clearly outlined.
But that would probably be easy to solve because you have this structured description of the API, so you can provide some helper tool that makes a call and compares the responses if they really match what's described.
It almost makes me think it would be cool to have like a macro that allows me to describe in my code and then automatically generate Swagger. But I feel like that's a rabbit hole I'd go down and not come out of for several weeks. That would be fun to live code. Let's live code some macros. One more question maybe before we're done with time? We're done with time.
Klimatyzacja.